So in the last section, we started talking about the state system in React. In this video, we're going to start to refactor our app component to make use of state. So the first thing we're going to do is make sure that we initialize our state when the component is first created. After that, we're going to make use of our state inside the render method. And then, I'm sure that you remember, at some point in the future, we will also update our state with setState after we successfully retrieve our location. So I'm going to flip back over to my code editor now inside of our class component. We already have one method called the render method, and that render method is required for every single React component we create. If we don't define the render function, React is going to throw up an error. Now, there's another function that we can define inside of our class-based component, and that's another very special function called the Constructor function. So this function is not required by React, unlike the render function, and it's a function that belongs to the JavaScript language itself. Now, this is a specifically named function that is particular to the JavaScript language, not specific to React. In a JavaScript class, the constructor function is the very first function that's going to be called anytime an instance of this class is created. Make sense? So in other words, anytime that we create a new instance of the app component and show it on the screen, this constructor function is going to be automatically called before anything else. Cool. And it makes sense that it's a very good location for us to initialize our state when our component is first created. It's not the only way to initialize state, however. I'm going to show you another method of initializing state in just a second, but right now I will stick with this particular way because this is what you're going to see all of the documentation about it, and it shows you this, how to initialize state using this method right here. So I want you to know it before you break it. The rules before you break the rules, that's what I mean. All right. When we define the constructor method, it's going to be automatically called with the props object. It's the same props object that we saw previously with our functional component. Now, before we do anything else inside this constructor function, we have to go through one more little step. We've got to call a function called super, and we have to pass the props as an argument to this function. All right, so what the heck is this super thing, right? So if you notice, we don't have any other functions inside this file called super, so what could it possibly do? Well, you got to remember that our app component is extending or borrowing functionality from the react.component base class right here. This base class has a constructor function of its own that has some code inside of it to set up our React component for us when we define a constructor function inside of our app class. So that means that we're essentially replacing the constructor function that is inside of the react.component class. But we still want to make sure that all of the setup code inside of this thing's constructor function still gets called. So to make sure of that, the React component's constructor function gets called, and we call it super with props. Super is a reference to the parent's constructor function, and that's all it is. So like I said, we have to do it every single time that we define our constructor function inside of a class-based component. If we don't define it, we're going to very quickly see an error message on our browser. All right, so now let's talk a little bit more about this state system. The entire reason we defined that constructor function was that we could initialize our state object. So in order to initialize our state object, underneath that super function, and super is always going to be the first thing in here. So underneath of it, I'm going to say this dot state equals an object. Okay, so this object, this is the state object. And it's going to eventually contain some different pieces of data that are very important and very relevant to our component that we're putting together. So now remembering in our case, the most relevant piece of data that we have is our latitude. So let's put that inside of here. And I'm going to simply say latitude. Now we're going to usually give it some reasonable default value. But in this case, we know that our latitude is going to eventually be a number as a property on our state object, but we don't have it yet. So we're going to give it a value of null by default, which means that we don't know what the latitude is just yet, but we will know it eventually. All right, so now we've got our constructor method defined, and then we have initialized our state object by creating a JavaScript object, and we put a property of a key value pair to it, and then assign the result of it to this state. Okay, so let's update our state property. Now, as I said just a little bit earlier, we don't know what the latitude value is just yet, but we will know it at some point in time as soon as we get that current position. So after creating the state object, we then assigned it to the this.state property. So now we can freely reference this state object and the properties inside of it from any function inside of our app component. For instance, down inside of my render method, where we try to print out our latitude, I'm going to put in a set of curly braces because we're going to reference a JavaScript variable, and I'll say this.state.latitude. Now, if we save this and go to our browser, there's nothing appearing on the screen because we've initialized it to be null. But very quickly, we can just replace it with a random number. I'm just going to say latitude is 25. So if I save this and then flip back over to my browser, I'll be able to see that my latitude is 25. So you get the general idea? It's that we might make use of this state property inside of our JSX or other functions inside of our component. We understand how we can initialize our state and how to reference it inside of some JSX. So the last thing we need to do, after we succeed in getting our position, we somehow update this latitude property in our state object. Now remember, the big key to this thing is that any time that we update our states object right here, our component will instantly re-render itself. So if we're going to somehow get our location with the get current position right here and then update our state object, our app is going to render itself and we should see a new latitude printed out on the screen. All right. Now, before we think about having to update our state, there's just one little change that I want to make to our class. The render method inside of a component is going to be called somewhat frequently, and we're going to learn a lot more about where the best place is to put calls that take some amount of time like this. Right now, I just want you to understand that we never want to initialize some work or some request or anything like that in the render method. The reason is that the render method is going to be getting called all the time. So rather than leaving this get current position call inside of here, I'm just going to cut it, and then I can move it up to my constructor, and I can paste it right underneath the state call. So now what does that do? It makes sure that when our app component shows up on the screen, we're going to attempt to start to get the user's current location. And then later on, when we call the render method again to update our component, we're not going to accidentally double fetch our current location. That's why we move it up inside into this constructor function. Okay. So now we can start to focus on updating our state object after getting our current location. So remember that the first argument to get the current position is a callback function. So this is a function that will be called at some point in time in the future. So rather than just doing a console log inside of here, I'm going to put a function body in here. And then on this line, I want to take my latitude out of that position object. And I want to use the latitude to update my state object. Okay, so a quick little reminder. Anytime that we want to update our state object, we're going to always use the function setState. All right, so now let's see. How are we going to update our state object using setState? I'm going to call this .setState, and I'm going to pass it to an object that has the update to state that I want to make. So in this case, I want to use the position object and some property inside of there to update the latitude property on my state object. So inside of that state, I'm going to say latitude is position.coords.latitude. So let's double check that at our browser, okay? Position, coords, latitude. Dude, that's all we have to do. So remember, anytime that you want to update your state, you're going to call setState. Come on, everybody together. setState. That's right. setState is a function that gets put on our app component automatically when we extended react.component. Now, what I really wanted to focus on here is that in order to update our state object, we will never write something like this.state.latitude equals position coords latitude. Got it? We will never do this. We never want to do a direct assignment to our state object. We can only do a direct assignment inside the this state object. Anytime that we want to change, update, or manipulate our state property, we always are going to call setState as opposed to doing a direct assignment. All right? So I'm going to delete that line right here. So now I'm going to save all this, and I'll flip back over to my browser, and I can see that I get the correct latitude to appear inside of my component. I hope you see that too. So that's it. If you didn't get what happened or you got confused a little bit because I was going a little fast there, don't worry, because we're going to get a ton of opportunities to understand exactly what state is coming up. Now, before we start to write any other code, I do want to show you all flow with a diagram to make sure that you really do understand exactly what happened. All right? Gotta love these diagrams, yes? All right, so I'm going to see you in the next section.